Well, thank you for having invited me here, and all of you for having decided to spend this, whatever it will be, 1 or 2 hours of your time here. That's my second visit to your university. Both times as kind of in addition to my visits to Kansas State. I understand there is a kind of competition between the two great universities, but it's nice that there is also cooperation. When I was thinking what to talk about this afternoon, it seemed to my mind that probably a good starting point would be to look at the way, at the balance sheet of political and social change that has taken place in Poland during last almost a quarter of century, and put it in a broader comparative perspective of change in post-communist European states in general. Obviously, I'm not going to go into too deep details, but concentrate mostly on two aspects. That means, how has the society changed over this now it is 24, almost 25 years, and how has politics changed? In other words, how this double transformation, socio-economic and political, worked, and with what results. I said that I'm going to put Poland in a comparative perspective, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to talk about all these countries in detail, but rather to point to where similarities are and where there are dissimilarities. As a kind of mixture between sociology and political science, what I am, I'm going to start with society and then move to politics. Now, as you very well know, a very important, probably the key aspect of system transformation in post-communist states as different from democratization of other regions of the world was that political change was taking place along with deep socio-economic transformation. If I was to put my finger on one single difference between democratization of formerly communist states on the one hand and democratization, say, in Latin America or Southern Europe in the 70s, the greatest difference would be, to my way of thinking, that in post-communist states, it was not just the political system that was being changed, but the whole fabric of society, unlike Spain, Portugal, Greece, Brazil, Argentina, or whatever else you have. Now, that of course created fundamental problem. Can these two changes be done effectively together? Why? Because as different from political change, economic and social change was highly controversial, costly, and resulting in substantial social problems for these societies. So at the beginning of the 90s, there were quite many commentators who were pessimistic about the possibility of successfully combining the two changes. There is some, for instance, argued that if you really want effective transformation of communist economies, you have to compromise on democratization, establish strong rule, and do it. For instance, Pinochet's Chile was sometimes given as an example. You want to make a change? Yes, you can, but then you have to have a regime which would not be responsive to the will of the population, because the will of the population would not favor that kind of reform. Fortunately, that kind of reasoning was ignored, at least in Poland, and also in several countries of Central Europe, unlike several of former Soviet republics. When Tadeusz Mazowiecki, our great transformation leader, whose death last week sorrowed the country very profoundly, started the first non-communist government in that part of Europe, one of the critical strategic decisions which his government made was to start a radical economic reform. Radical. That was after the name of the then Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, Leszek Balcerowicz. It was then known as Balcerowicz Plan. The plan, the program, consisted of 14 new laws, all of them passed in short time by Parliament in December of '89, coming into effect on the 1st of January, and changing the Polish economy overnight from command economy to free competitive economy. Now, there are many people who criticize the radicalism of this reform, and not without good reason. There were negative aspects of the radical reform, like recession, which was deeper and longer than Prime Minister Balcerowicz predicted. He predicted, when he presented his program, that the recession would last no longer than 1 year. It lasted three and a half. Only after 3.5, the decline of economy stopped. He predicted that it would be on about 10 to 15% level of the loss of GNP. It was 25. He predicted unemployment to be marginal because he hoped that emerging private or expanding private sector would take care of people losing jobs in public sector, but as a fact, unemployment during this first 4 years went to the level of 13 to 15% of the active labor force. Having said this all, I would, however, conclude that this radical reform was one of the best things that could have been done, one of the great successes of the Polish transformation. We can see the outcome from the perspective of this 20 plus years. The accumulated growth of Poland's economy over this period is about 100%. That means the volume of Polish product doubled. The standard of living increased considerably. There are objective sociological indicators of the better lifestyle, conditions of life. One of the most telling indicator is the lengthening of life. So people live 3 to 4 years longer than they used years back, which is not that obvious, because in Russia, for instance, there has been a decline of the length of predicted length of life. Finally, one of the obvious proofs that this socio-economic transformation was successful was the way in which Poland, unlike other countries of the region, was able to survive relatively well the years of world financial crisis. Let me give you 3 figures. The accumulated growth of Poland's economy since 1908 is 15.5%. For European Union as a whole, it is 1%. For countries with common currency, euro, it is minus 1%. For the first time in history, the economic distance between Poland and the better developed countries of Europe narrowed. When we when we started the transformation, let me put this way, GNP per capita of Poland was about 30% of that of Germany. Now it is about 58% of that of Germany. True, we are still almost twice poorer than our German neighbors and friends, but the difference between 58 and 30 is telling. There have been several countries which started on a better economic level than Poland, and with which we have been able to catch up. Hungary is a good example. When we both, Hungary and Poland, started the transformation in about the same time, the difference between GNP per capita was about 25% in favor of Hungary. Now, for this year, the GNP per capita in both countries are equal. So we have catch up. So this is a rosy picture, but it would be unfair to stop just here without saying what are the less rosy aspects of the change. There are 3 most. 2 are economic or socio-economic, the other is demographic. The first obvious setback is that this transformation produced the class of excluded, not just poor, but people who are in more or less permanent poverty, where unemployment is becoming hereditary. The young generation of young adults who not only have unemployed parents, or very often single mother, because that's often the pattern, but also have no prospect of getting their own employment. This class of excluded is estimated by sociologists and economists differently, but I think a conservative number would be about 5 to 6% of the total population, compared to less than 2% of people living below poverty line during the communist system. In other words, during the communist system, it was extremely difficult to fall below the poverty line. you really had to be a special case, like for instance, families affected by alcoholism, or broken families with very large number of kids. So I'm not saying that nobody lived in poverty, but the proportion of those living in poverty was definitely much lower. So this is one thing, the emergence of this class of people living in poverty, permanent poverty. The other connected with this aspect is much greater differentiation in the society. Obviously, the communist societies were not egalitarian, in spite of their basically egalitarian ideology, but the differences were less marked. And by this I mean two types of differences, vertical and horizontal. In the vertical sense, the distance between the beneficiaries of the transformation and the losers, between the affluent and the poor, has increased considerably. If we use the Gini indicator, the Gini indicator for Poland for last year is 0.34, which may not look to you very alarming, because this Gini indicator for the United States is in low 0.40s, 41, 42, and for Russia it is almost 0.6, which puts Russia more or less on the level of such countries as Brazil or some other countries outside Europe. But if you use this argument when talking to a Pole, she or he would say, what the hell does it mean to us? The important thing is that 24 years ago, the Gini indicator for Poland was 0.23. So this is a considerable increase of inequality. This is what I call vertical. And that, of course, creates a certain psychological problem. Many people whose standard of living has even improved compared to what it was, feel deprivated. Why? Because they see others. Well, I will give you an example which my friend Dale Hairspring would particularly like. The military. All right. The military are, relatively speaking, losers of the transformation. Not because their conditions of service, salaries and so on went down. They did not. But 25 years ago, a general of the armed forces or a senior officer, a colonel, belonged to the best remunerated citizens of the Republic. Now, if a general compared his position to that of a manager of a private bank, he must feel as a beggar. And the same will be true about a large number of middle-class positions, university professors included, of course. I'm not saying that university professors live in poverty. In fact, they benefited in many ways from the change of the system. But again, we used to be among the economic elite. We no longer are, because these people in private sector can look down on us, at least from financial point of view, not from some others. So that is one of the reasons why people are less happy with the balance sheet than they sort of objectively should be. The other aspect of this differentiation is horizontal. That is, the differences between the developed and the underdeveloped parts of Poland became very deep. True, these differences exist. The East and the South, or that is the East-South, not the South on the western part. That has always been less affluent, less modern, etc. But the difference now between the developed west, northwest, and the less developed southeast is considerably greater. And when we even have a special legislation that makes it obligatory for more affluent provinces to contribute part of their revenue for the compensation fund that would help poorer provinces. It's very controversial. People with affluent provinces like Warsaw dislike it for obvious reasons, but it shows that the governments desperately try to do something about it. In fact, when we joined the European Union 9 years ago, this accession intensified the horizontal differentiation. Because if even the poorer part benefited from Poland becoming member of the EU, they benefited less than the western part, partly for the reason which is sometimes not fully understood, that is what proximity with Germany means. When you look at the small towns along the Polish-German frontier now, you can see a lot of small business established almost exclusively for German customers. Along the frontier, you can see plenty, for instance, of barber shops. Not because people there use barber services more often than in the rest of the country, but because the Germans drive over the border, they pay half of what they would pay back in Germany. Of course, they don't drive from Rhineland, they drive from this parts neighboring parts. Okay. And now there's the third non-economic problem which we have. It is decline of the birth rate. One of the greatest social achievements of post-war communist Poland was the ability of the society to compensate for enormous demographic losses caused by the Second World War. Let me just quote three figures. Pre-war Poland's population numbered 35 million. After the war, the first census registered 24 million. The difference was partly, or largely, caused by disproportionately high number of physical losses. 6 million Polish citizens perished during the war, half of them Jewish community, the rest non-Jewish. Then the proportion of physical losses in Poland was the highest among all nations participating in the war. Obviously, in absolute numbers, other nations like the Soviets or the Germans lost more, but in proportion to the size of population, not a single country lost that many people. To this came the loss of the population of territories incorporated to the Soviet Union, the eastern territories. So there was 24 million in 1946. In 1989, the population of Poland numbered 38 million. So 14 million of net increase. And when I stress the word net, it is because that 14 million was achieved in spite of the fact that about 2 million Poles emigrated throughout this post-war period. But even forgetting those, in statistical terms, forgetting those who emigrated, not in human terms, it means that we compensated for the population loss, in fact, with a surplus. Now, 24 years later, the population of Poland is again 38 million. That is, in terms of demographic growth, these last 24 years are lost, but this is not the end of the story. Last year, for the first time, the number of deaths exceeded the number of births by 40,000. And the decline of population would have been much sharper had it not been for the lengthening of the of lives. So, but the lengthening of life has its obvious limits, which I'm very keenly aware at my age. all of us may have some hopes that this general rule would not apply to us, but I'm afraid that hopes are not very well based. Now, why?
Tell them the story what you do with your uncle and how you raised that funeral. How you Catholic Church, the military, but your uncle.
Oh yes, but well, I will say this is not related to what I'm telling. It's related only in the sense that it dealt with problem of life and death. But thanks, I know where I will mention this a little more, a little later. Now, what happened? Why people have so few children? The average number of children per woman in the this period of time when women have children is now 1.31, and for natural reproduction of population, the required indicator is 2.1. So we have one of the lowest. So what happened? Obviously, it is not the result of Poland's losing interest in sexual life. That's not the explanation. That would be an attractive explanation to say that preoccupied with other things like democratic politics, they are no longer making sex. But as far as I know, that is not the case. But what is the case is that people, young people, prolong marriages, or particularly having children. I am a very good example, or my family is a very good example of that process. When I was 45, my grandson was born rather early, considering the fact that my father was 50 when I was born. So I was 45 when I became grandfather. And the accumulated effort of myself and my son. I was 21 when my son was born. He was 24 when his son was born. Then 2 years later, my granddaughter was born. So I have two wonderful, successful, well-educated grandchildren. Children in their 30s, well, not exactly, young adults. Neither of them has any plan of making me great, which I can live with rather comfortable. My daughter-in-law is very unhappy She is not a grandmother yet. This is not atypical. It's very typical, particular for educated middle class. And that is another part of the story, which you will not read from the statistics. That is, people, these children who are born disproportionately often come from families where they should not come from. Uneducated, poor, broken, and so on. If there were not for these very poor and uneducated families, the birth rate in Poland would have been even lower. Now, so what happens? I think what happens is that there's a fundamental change of patterns of culture. Family is no longer that important as it used to be. Women find their life goals not necessarily in raising the families, but in professional career, and so on and so forth. So this is a cost which society has to pay for something that is fundamentally a very positive process. People have more ambition, they study longer, they are involved in interesting careers. All this is good, but that there is a price to pay. Is there any answer to this? When I was asked once by the minister in charge of these problems, what could be the solution, I said, don't fool yourself. There's no government policy which we can plan and which would make my grandchildren and other people of their generation to change their lifestyle. The only answer to the demographic problem is to open our frontiers, to accept immigrants. But say this to those politicians and to their electorate who believe in the principle Poland for Poles only. There is a schizophrenic kind of attitude in Poland that sees this ethnic purity of the society as an advantage. I don't see any particular advantages in the fact that over 90% of citizens of Poland are ethnic Poles, unlike the situation in pre-war Poland and unlike the situation in very many other countries. I don't see, for instance, that feeling of unhappiness among my American or Canadian friends because there are so many immigrants in these countries. So, learning from others, we should open the frontier, and there are many people who would be more than happy to settle. And this is not what opening the frontiers for immigrants means from West European countries. If Western Europe is open, or to the extent to which it is open to immigrants, there are immigrants from very different cultures, from Arab countries or from, to a large extent, Arab countries or from Africa. In the case of Poland, there is a very huge potential for immigration from the neighboring, culturally close Slavic countries like Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, etc. But having said this, I would conclude that in terms of socio-economic change, this transformation has been a big success. Politics is a little more complicated. Of course, I would start with positive. Being an optimist, of course, you know that optimists are in it for pessimists. Being an informed pessimist, I would say that the political transformation has been a great success and a very positive surprise to many. Not so much to me, because I was optimistic from the beginning about it. But for instance, my great friend for many years, late Samuel Huntington, in his famous third wave of democratization book, predicted that Poland would be one of the countries of the reverse wave. Why Poland? Because of the tradition of military rule and authoritarian tendencies in Poland's politics. That was what Huntington wrote in '91. And strange as it sounds now, I don't remember anybody at that time writing a review in which the reviewer would say, someone, Huntington, doesn't know what he's talking about. Why Poland would never go back from the process of democratization. In fact, there were other worries which I shared too. In 1988, within International Political Science Association, we have formed a small group of scholars studying comparatively processes of democratization. We started with doing this for non-communist states, because that was just a year before democratization started in the communist world. But then we extended the study, and then, as we put it in the book was published in '95, edited by Adam Przeworski, my friend and former collaborator. The title is Sustainable Democracy. And one of the conclusions, but it's a collective book, not a collection of studies, but a book that was written collectively but, by a group of scholars. Now, one of our conclusions was, be aware that gross social dislocations, particularly unemployment and social differentiation, could be dangerous for democracy. Now, almost 20 years later, I would say, fortunately, our worries were excessive. Things did not go that way, at least not in Poland and not in countries of Central Europe. But it is true that if you look at other post-communist countries, Russia in particular, you can find corroboration of these worries. I'm not going to talk now about Russia, because that's a fascinating subject, and I could easily spend the rest of my time talking about this. So what happened? Why were we wrong when we worried about the political consequences of this socio-economic change? Because, what I think, we underestimated the great value of free election. Free election instead of rioting on the streets. Look, in Poland, several times when the government, the communist government, took unpopular economic decisions, people went on the streets, sometimes resulting in bloodshed. But the economic reasons for this were nothing compared to the suffering which poorer people in Poland were exposed to, particularly in the 90s. So why didn't they rebel? For very obvious reason. They had an alternative. 4 years after the beginning of the transformation, they, in the election which took place almost exactly 20 years ago, they gave majority in the parliament to two parties which had their roots in the communist system, Alliance of Democratic Left and Polish Peasants' Party, and the new coalition, to a considerable extent, corrected the economic policy, didn't call it back, but corrected it. And similar thing was happening in other countries. In Lithuania a year before, in Hungary a year after Poland, and so on. So this is how democracy really confirms its value, its pragmatic value, and it works. When we look at the record of democratic transformation in Poland, the conclusion would be that Poland belongs to a small and very limited group of fully successful post-communist democracies, along with the Czech Republic, Slovenia, Slovakia, and Lithuania probably. There are some doubts about Estonia and Latvia, and certainly about Balkan states, etc. The Freedom House rankings put Poland constantly in the best category, fully free, with the highest possible ranking, 1-1. As you know, Freedom House uses these two columns. One is political rights, the other is civil rights, and in both Poland is at the highest possible level. True, we had our domestic political problems, but they were not particularly serious. Once in '95, the president, very unhappy with the government and the parliament, threatened us because I was then in parliament, with the unconstitutional dissolution of the parliament. But these were words. He didn't do it. So the democracy more or less was able to defend itself. But having said this, I would say that there are negative aspects of Polish life, political life, also. There are two. One is the very low level of political involvement of the citizens. Only in one election, during all these 24 years, the turnout was 68%. That was a record high, 68. 68 for very many European states would be very low. And this was the highest. The highest participation was in the second round of presidential election of 1995. And the reason why it was so relatively high was that the competition was very sharp. Lech Wałęsa against Alexander Kwaśniewski. The average participation is below 50% and going down. Membership in political parties or political organizations is much lower than in other countries. The largest party in Poland, the largest in terms of party membership, has a little over 100,000 members, and that paradoxically is not one of the strongest parties, it's one of the weaker parties. Weakest parties, the Polish Peasant Party. The ruling party has 44,000 members in a nation of 38 million. The largest party of the opposition has about 40,000 members. So this is very low. In other words, a very large proportion of Poles do not use these democratic rights which most of us were impassively waiting for, and some of us were working for in the past few years. And there may be very many reasons for this. The other negative aspect, I think, is very, even more dangerous, which is the deepening of the political conflict. The political conflict in Poland in last years reached the point at which it endangers the normal functioning, not only of the state, but of the nation. By this I mean the degree of hostility. Obviously, in democracy, it is natural for political parties to differ. Otherwise, there would be a one-party state, not imposed by force, but resulting from the miracle of everybody being of the same mind. That kind of miracles don't happen. But can you imagine an American politician, and not from a margin, but from one of the main parties, accusing the adversaries of being instruments of hostile powers, deliberately trying to make your country dependent on some other power, or accusing the president, you don't have prime minister, so I must say, accusing the president of having conspired to arrange the catastrophe of the aircraft of his predecessor. Now, you cannot imagine this. Or, if
Oh man, I don't know.
or I will put it differently. If by some strange combination, an American politician came forward with statements of this sort, that would be her or his political funeral. That would be the end of the story. But not in Poland. Former Prime Minister of Poland accusing his successor of deliberately trying to make Poland into a German-Russian condominium. The main party of the opposition, Law and Justice, setting special hearings in the parliament to the effect that the crash of Smolensk was deliberately caused by some unknown persons. But as far as I know, they do not point the finger at me as the perpetrator. They have some more important people in mind. People in government, Polish and Russian. That's basically the idea. With zero proofs. It's being done against all possible proofs which show that this was a combination of bad luck and negligence. Nothing. So these are very negative aspects. The other aspect which I find also negative is the declining political prestige and influence of the Catholic Church. And I'm saying this from the position of a non-believer, whom I am for very many years, not for all my life, but for very many years, from my childhood, late childhood. Why I think it is a negative phenomenon? Because Roman Catholic Church has played a great role in Polish post-war politics. I say post-war because it also played an important role in more ancient history, but particularly post-war. During the communist period, the Church not only was the bulwark of freedom, that amount of freedom that was possible within the regime, but also, what was very important, it was a very strong force for moderation. under Primate Wyszyński first, after his death, under Primate Glenn, the church played a role of moderator. That was particularly clear in two instances, critical instances, when the very security of Poland was endangered. In '56, when Poland was very close to sharing the tragic fate of Hungary, suffering from Soviet intervention. Now, there were many factors that made Poland emerge from the crisis safe, but one of the factors was the role of the church in general and personally Cardinal Wyszyński as the head of the church. And then when the martial law was declared, Poland was again on a very dangerous point, since it could have very well result in sort of national uprising crushed by the Soviets. What did the church do? The church urged moderation. It did not support the martial law, but in the first sermon which Primate Glenn delivered, he begged people to behave. He used the word, the sentence, not a drop of Polish precious blood being shed, which everybody knew what he had in mind.
If I may interrupt for just a minute, we're about to lose people just because of the time.
Okay.
And I want to take a moment just to thank you for coming and I appreciate you.